So what are you seeing in terms, because I mean, that's an interesting point. So, I mean, that's, you know, we were talking about that earlier. Mileage is actually really important on a car, and you probably see this as well.
Yes.
People buying...
Stole my thunder. I was about
Sorry, I'm sorry.
Dive
Do you
in.
want to thunder in then?
No, carry on. You'll do a much better job.
Okay, thanks. Do the people that you see, are they really sort of looking to buy cars to use them, or are people...
It's a tricky one. I think it really depends on the type of car it is. I mean, this GT3 that's sat here, it's done 70,000 miles, so it's hardly a low mileage arm when it's being campaigned on track and everything else. But I think if you're of that mindset, you're buying a GT3 to use it, right? I mean, I hate when people buy something like that and keep it in a box. If it's something that's perhaps a little bit more special, like your Camaro, that's original, low mileage and everything else, then it should be stashed, well, not stashed away, but it should be sort of used for special occasions only, kind of thing. Yeah. But it's down to these days, kind of some people of this camp where if something's got, we're selling like Yaris GRs with 1,000 miles on it, and people are going, oh, I can't put any miles on that.
Yes, you can.
Yaris.
Yeah.
They're still great.
They're great cars.
Still a Yaris, right? So, yeah.
I mean, is that what you see as well? I mean, people are actually buying these cars to use, or are they buying them just to keep as investment pieces?
I think it's pretty much as Millen said. It depends on the provenance of the car already and how it's already been used or not used. And you know, if you're buying a car which has very low miles on it and is quite special, then potentially going to destroy inherent value or the perceived value of the car by putting the miles on. So, yeah,
I think
it's just horses for courses. What's already happened to the car. Yeah. What I think is quite tragic is that people are buying new cars, high performance cars that are quite special and should be used, and literally
keeping the delivery mileage.
Putting them away. People spend millions literally, and they're just not even being used.
No,
I can't see the point.
No.
Those aren't true enthusiasts. They're just
speculators.
Just speculators, investors, and they can afford to buy these things, and they take them away from people who are really going to appreciate and use cars. I think that's quite sad.
No, I agree.
From a funding perspective, I'm very agnostic, just like people to borrow money.
Yeah, of course.
So from that respect, as pure business finance company, I don't care. But from a personal perspective, I think it's quite tragic.
Yeah, it's a waste, really. Yeah.
Well,
we're seeing a whole, like a younger generation who, especially now with the ULEZ coming in and things like that, who are buying ULEZ exempt or compliant cars that are a bit quirky, just to daily drive them, to get around, because they're 2005, whatever, it is no longer compliant. So people are now leaning towards late 70s and early 80s stuff to really daily drive as well. So it's quite nice that there's still like a young blood of interest coming through the ranks. But it's a shame to see stuff locked away, I think.
It's an interesting question, actually. And if you've got any opinions, do let us know. But going back to the younger people coming through, sort of looking at that sort of late 60s, early 70s stuff.
Yeah.
For which I consider myself one of them, of course. I've always thought it's interesting because, when I was really young, it was the sort of 50s stuff that people were, sort of hankering after. I remember when a 275 GTB was, like 150 grand. That's sort of aging me slightly. But do you think that just moves on generationally?
Yeah, I mean, the fact that you can go out and spend, upwards of £1 million on a Skyline these days sort of blows my mind. So I think, it really is sort of almost cyclical with the generational thing. So, I mean, there's a lot of hyperinflated stuff out there using the GTRs, again, as an example at the moment. But with that, I think it's just a sign of the times. And I feel for cars like this Triumph behind us, 1949 Triumph Roadster, a very pretty thing. But sadly, the audience for it is quite literally dying off.
Yes.
And I think there's a big challenge ahead of people. The vintage Bentley world is probably one of the only that's immune from it because it's still an accessible price point, £200,000 to £500,000 accessible. I use the term lightly, but the rest of that era of stuff is really struggling with a kind of generational shift in interest.
And it doesn't really engage with people's interest either, does it? Because they
I love
find it hard to relate to. Yes,
it's quite. I think I'm quite.
You see, we asked a similar question of Tom Hartley Jr. when we did a podcast with him, and I said, who's buying the old vintage stuff pre-Second World War stuff because of the generation, and his view is, well, every good collector should have
something in their collection.
And I said, yes, but that's like one or two of people who collect.
Yeah.
There's still a lot of this stuff that's around that's no
Yeah,
one's
I think
particularly
there's inherited interests as well.
Yeah.
So be it the car's been inherited by a family member, or it's my grandfather had one of these, my father had one of these. I think that we're seeing that kind of tapering to an end, sadly.
See, and again, that was from an investor's point of view he was talking about,
I get
rather
that.
than an enthusiast's point of view. So if you're an enthusiast, you're highly unlikely to go out and buy a pre-war car.
Yeah.
I don't think so, anyway.
No.
But
Well, I mean, tell us what your other half, what her motivation was, because it's a rapier.
And it's a Model A Speedster.
Okay.
Yeah, so Georgia's got a 1929 Ford Model A Speedster, so it's like a boat tail wooden frame thing. It's really, really cool. It looks like a sort of 30s race car. It's built more recently, but on an original platform.
Yeah.
And I think for her, it was she's massively into the vintage Bentley stuff. She does a lot of work with William Metcalf down at Vintage Bentley, and he's really making an effort to try and keep younger generation interested in the cars that he sells and restores, because otherwise the customer base disappears. And frankly, the price point wasn't so accessible. So Georgia found this amazing boat tail thing, and it's been smoking around in it like it's sort of a new Range Rover.
So there's a question for you. So there is a trend, and you've got companies like Lunaz, you know well, who are converting older classic cars and vintage cars into an electrifying, put electric powertrains in. And then there's also the add-on of, with classic cars, do you keep them authentic and original as to how they're originally built, or do you bring them up to current day, modern day standards and put in parts that make them an easier
car to live with,
and drive, and a bit of air conditioning maybe. Or are you a purist, or do you think maybe making vintage cars more usable?
That's the way to go.
That might get interest.
I think you're restricted heavily with certainly the pre- and post-war stuff, because there's so many limitations as to what you could do to improve them.
True.
And also from a value and provenance perspective, a lot of this stuff, you'd be crazy to modify them. Whereas where David Lunaz is sticking electric power plants in mass-produced Range Rovers, I can see the appeal. I get why that works, because they're not really doing anything too sacrilege. I mean, there's a guy who's done one to a Testarossa, and I think that's abhorrent. So, I think it's really subjective based on the type of car it is, but there's definitely a market for, like you say, these sort of resto-modded and retrofitted stuff. I think just to kind of re-engage a younger audience into the interest of. People love the idea of owning some of this classic stuff, but they just can't get their head around actually using it.
It is quite challenging.
Well, the drive can be challenging. So you look cool, but actually it's not. Sometimes it's just not the best drive.
I know in my Camaro, I just end up sweaty because there's no aircon.
There you go. I said you need the air conditioning.
I know. Well, exactly.